All right, everyone, we have a mass mushroom poisoning. It looks a little bit like the Australian case, actually. That was earlier this year. This one looks more like a mistake, though, unfortunately. I'm going to give a little bit of advice on amateur mycology. Disclaimer, this video is not health advice. I cannot tell you which mushrooms are safe to ingest or not unless I see them myself and do spore printing and all of the other things that you have to do if you're an amateur mycologist. But I'm going to read this verbatim first and foremost. 11 sickened in York County on toxic mushrooms. Peach Bottom Township. Children and adults were transported to a hospital in Pennsylvania Friday night after being sickened by mushrooms, authorities said. Emergency medical personnel responded to a report around 9:30 p.m. of 11 people becoming ill after ingesting the mushrooms in Peach Bottom Township, the Delta Cardiff Volunteer Company Station 57 said in a social media post. Units were advised that 11 people had ingested toxic mushrooms and were ill, the post said. The post referred to an emergency in York County as a mass casualty situation and said emergency units were dispatched from York, Lancaster, and Hartford counties. Delta Cardiff Fire Chief Laura Taylor said the adults and children were transported to Wellspan York Hospital and were in stable condition. WPMT-TV reported. The Pennsylvania State Police also responded to the private residence. WPMT reported. Peach Bottom Township is on the west side of Susquehanna River at the Maryland line. Now, we're going to talk about mushrooms. Billions of pounds of perfectly edible food go to waste every single year simply because people don't understand mushrooms. You should not wild forage mushrooms unless you know what you're doing. There are some deadly species. For example, Amanita pantherina looks fairly innocuous. It's just a white mushroom with a little stalk and everything else. It will kill you. It will knock out your liver and you'll probably die if you ingest too much of it. Even a couple of bites would be enough. Most poisonous mushrooms, when we talk about poison mushrooms, people have the wrong sort of mentality. They think, oh my god, poisonous mushrooms, they must be deadly. Most of them are not deadly. Most of them will force you to vomit and shit all over yourself. Well, that's basically the limitations of their poison. You'd be better off foraging mushrooms in some cases than plants, actually. There's some plants, doll's eyes, for example. Oh boy, eat a couple of those and see what happens. You'll probably die. Nightshade, for example. Those berries look tasty. The black nightshade, by the way, is actually edible and tastes a little bit like a blueberry. But you don't want to eat the leafy material, and if you get the wrong kind of nightshade, you'll probably die. At the very least, you'll be high as balls. You'll start hallucinating, quite literally. Climbing nightshade, deadly nightshade, it's a hallucinogen. It's a deliriant, actually. Plants are much more deadly than the greens of carrots, the greens of tomatoes. There are the greens of potato plants. There are a lot of, especially nightshade family plants that are considerably toxic. With mushrooms, it's a little bit different. For example, I've been an amateur mycologist since middle school. I spent my summers wandering around in the hills, and when I wasn't gathering bricks and rocks and shit like that or doing gardening, I was studying mushrooms. I had a whole journal actually filled with pictures that I had made. I would take my, the colored pencils out into the woods, and I would make pictures of mushrooms. I had hundreds and hundreds of species that I documented. I had a little field guide. I identified them. And I had all sorts of pictures. I wish that I still had the journal, actually. I'd be love to show it off. Most mushrooms are fairly innocuous, and the poisonous varieties are generally easily differentiated from the edible ones. For example, with morels. I've only seen morels a couple of times. It's fairly easy to tell the difference between the honeycomb structure of a common or great morel and the false morel that looks like a piece of General Tso's chicken. They don't look anything alike. I don't know how people can actually get them confused. Boletus, false boletus versus, the common bolete, or the great boletus, or the pine boletus, the one with the little black flecks on its stalk. They are fairly easily differentiated from one another. I'm confident that if I go out in the woods and I'm gathering morels, hen of the woods, boletus, something like a fairy ring mushroom. Those are probably the most easy to reckon. I'm confident that I can consume them and I won't get poisoned because I know what I'm doing. But it takes years and years of time. I've been doing this since middle school. I'm 36 now. I love mushrooms. Mycology is definitely one of my guilty pleasures. I can't wait to grow mushrooms on a commercial scale, actually, because I know what I'm doing. I know that I'm capable of doing that. I'm not going to poison anyone. Everyone can eat the fucking mushrooms and it'll be fine. What happens, though, is that you get some family, and they're from the suburbs or something. You know, they've seen like 2 species of mushrooms in their entire life. They go to the North Woods, they go out into the middle of the hinterlands of Pennsylvania, and they say, well, these look like they're probably edible. They look kind of like the mushrooms in the store. That's not the kind of mushroom that you want to grab, by the way. The little white mushrooms are probably not the ones that you want to eat. Morels, Boletus, some of those other species, they're much more easily differentiated from the poisonous species that you would generally find. Like, for example, there are only a couple of species in the entire world that grow on wood that are actually significantly poisonous. Most of them are just unpalatable. They're woody. I mean, they're growing on a log. They kind of taste what they're growing on. That's basically the same. Those mushrooms tend to be innocuous. They might not be edible, but they're probably not going to kill you. The big one is Amanita pantherina. That was the one that was used in the poisoning in Australia months ago, actually, and that was clearly on purpose. You can't really, you know, yeah, if you know anything about mushrooms, especially if you're using a food processor to put it in your casserole or beef Wellington or whatever the fuck it was, you know what you're doing. That was deliberate. And I believe that the bitch has been charged with that, and that's probably for the best. Other than pantherina and a few of the other Amanita species, though, the tendency is towards mushrooms being fairly innocuous. A lot of them are inedible, but it's not because they're poisonous. It's because they don't taste good. They're not choice. Common morel, choice. That's delicatessen level mushrooms. Boletus, for example. And you got to get them when they first fruit, because otherwise there's going to be little flies all over them, and pretty soon they'll be all cratered and fucked up. Boletus grow all over the place, in the pine forests out behind my house, for example. I've eaten them before. I've eaten fairy ring mushrooms. I've eaten, well, on one occasion I managed to eat a morel. It was pretty good, actually. It's way better than the kind that you get in the store. Mushrooms are an overlooked food, because most people fear them. They think that every mushroom that they come across is poisonous. Well, that means more for me. So, yeah, there were 11 people poisoned in Pennsylvania because they were too stupid to understand which mushrooms they were getting. Thankfully, they're all expected to recover. They're in stable condition. And so it wasn't pantherina. Otherwise, at least a couple of them by now would have croaked. Their liver would give out. It's highly hepadestructive, actually. So it wasn't pantherina. They don't list the species that they got a hold of. Probably they thought that it was like, you know, innocuous little white mushrooms, but it was some amanita or a grisette or something like that. Maybe false morels or something along those lines. So we're hoping for a speedy recovery, especially for the kids. Make sure that if you're going to wild harvest mushrooms, you know what you're doing. You can get a shit ton of food, really high-end food, by the way, full of vitamin D and everything else. Mushrooms are good for you, cultivated mind, by the way. But you need to know what you're doing. You definitely need to take a couple of years. This is my advice. Take a couple of years, take a mushroom field guide, go out in the field, and try to identify things. Some of them are going to be more easily identified than others. But once you do learn that skill, oh boy, oh yeah, your stew is going to be on the next level. Trust me, I've cooked wild mushrooms into soups on multiple occasions. They are much more tasty than what you get in stores. Just be careful. That's about all. Peace out.